Hello everyone, and welcome back to another educational romp through the digital age. I am Samantha Rose, and let's just get started with this one, shall we? 1981 began much as 1980 had come to an end, as far as video games were concerned. However, 1981 would shape itself into being one of the most influential and important eras of the gaming industry, and this is credited for damn good reason, too. In Britain, the popularity of arcades was growing as new, more advanced, and more engaging games appeared on the scene. Atari kept adding to their massive family of cartridges, which were totally saturating the market at this point as far as cartridge games go, which made the VCS the home video game machine to be had. Handheld clones of wildly popular coin-ops of the time released to keep kids on a lower budget entertained, and the UK's home computer business, though still restricted mainly to the soldering iron brigade, was gradually expanding. Then, 3 companies released 3 brand new microcomputers that would give this whole entire business the swift kick in the ass it needed. Based out of Cambridge, Acorn launched the Acorn Atom, which offered a nippy 6502 8-bit processor, a bright and colorful display, sound, a real typewriter keyboard, and a whole-ass whopping 2 kilobytes of memory for around the $120 mark in kit form, or you could own it for $170 already put together and ready to go. Plug this thing into a TV, hook up a standard cassette recorder for storing and retrieving programs, and you were ready to rock. Now this was a computer that actually looked as if it could do things. Here was a computer that you could possibly afford and did not have to build yourself. You could use a program provided that you could work out the bizarre abbreviated form of BASIC that the Atom used. You were able to use this thing as a business computer even, so long as you could afford the upgrade that boosted the memory up to 12K. But you could use this to play games overall, which is what people bought it for. That being said, there were still a few limitations, but it was the fact that this thing was cheap, it was fast, and it could generate high-resolution graphics and even sounds and original music tracks that made the Acorn Atom a pretty solid platform of personal entertainment to be had. A true industry titan, I feel. Within a few short months of its release, the machine had a steadily growing catalog of games that one could play, which were mostly simple takeoffs of wildly popular coin-ops such as Asteroids and even Space Invaders, which were being programmed and sold mail order by the Atom users themselves. The same time the Acorn Atom launched, Sinclair Research followed up the minor success of the ZX80 with an updated model called the ZX81. Highly innovative and original names these guys were, let me tell ya. Upon first glance, the ZX81 wasn't all too different from its short-lived predecessor, a small slab of plastic, matte black this time instead of white, with a flat touch-sensitive keyboard. Compared to the Acorn Atom, it looked pretty fucking basic, and it only came with 1K of memory, but it did have fairer pricing on its side. At $49.95 for the kit version and $69.95 for the fully built machine, this thing was incredibly affordable for many at the time. A computer for the masses, it seems. Sinclair even took the bold, brave step of advertising the ZX81 in the Sunday paper, thus succeeding in alluring numerous formerly normal people into the enticing world of computer tinkering. Aside from pricing, the ZX81's other notably endearing feature was that it was incredibly easy to program and use. Typing commands on a flat keyboard was somewhat wearing on the fingers, however, and so, just as with the ZX80 before it, Sinclair's designers fixed this issue by instead implementing a way that just one single keypad press could enter an entire basic command. These commands were all printed on the key, so users were very quickly able to come to terms with knocking up their own simple commands and games, the earliest form of modding perhaps, or no. What do you all think? An entire library of how to program your ZX81 books were released to better satisfy the clamor of this new rising generation of budding and talented coders. Indeed, several ZX81, and oh my god, you guys, I am sorry, but I just realized that the 81 is in reflection of the year this thing came out, the stupid bitch that I am. Users would go to buy themselves one of these nifty little books that had full program listings in preference to a cassette of pre-recorded games, being the machine's tape interface was so damn slow and incredibly unreliable that it could take literal hours of fiddling about just to get a game to load up on the motherfucker at all. And though the ZX81 only used 4 microprocessors as opposed to the wonderful ZX80's whopping 21, the ZX81 was a much faster and much more powerful machine. The ZX81 used a larger system chip, and because it didn't have the ZX80's "oh hell no, I can't think and keep the screen working at the same time" problem, action games were no issue to play at all. The ZX81's lack of sound, however, as well as any kind of high-resolution graphics capabilities, were just a minor setback. Surprisingly, its biggest allure being that users got used to piloting a letter O around the galaxy, or they were shooting down ever-advancing swarms of A's. This was all part of the ZX81's charm, however, and besides, having to use your own imagination only seemed to make the games that much better. Which, imagine that, you guys. Gamers back then were so easy to please. It wasn't all that easy for one to go and program the absolute perfect Space Invaders clone using only 1K of memory, however. And fortunately, Sinclair went on to release the ZX81 with 2 useful add-ons. The most essential of these was a $50 16K RAM upgrade that you could plug, albeit shakily so, into a slot on the back of the computer. Also priced at $50, there was the ZX printer, which was a small but highly ingenious device that resembled a space-age toilet paper dispenser. The fact that this thing could only print on 4-inch wide rolls of aluminum-coated paper meant that one couldn't really use this all too much to write up that job application, or to even ask for an overdraft. But, for the newer generation of programmers back then, this was just the thing for churning out hard physical copies of their own code. The Commodore VIC-20 was the third micro to be introduced to the world in 1981. Commodore, which was an American-based company whose PET had proved to be quite popular in both business and educational environments, had spotted the potential of the home market, and so they came up with a machine that was almost a cut-down version of the Atari 800. The VIC-20 had 3.5K of memory on board, a real typewriter keyboard, bright, full-color graphics, very good sound facilities, and it could accept software on plug-in cartridges, and you could even hook up your own personal joysticks to this thing, making this machine a highly ideal gaming machine in several different respects. Now, this isn't to say that the VIC-20 didn't have its own shortcomings. For one, this thing was the most expensive machine out of these 3 computers. The machine itself costing $190, but you then also had to buy Commodore's very own special $45 cassette deck in order to store and retrieve programs on common, standard audio tapes, which ultimately elevated the price to nearly $240. Also, this was not as easy to program as the ZX81 was. Using the machine's more advanced facilities, such as high color graphics and sound, meant you had to learn lots and lots of numerical memory addresses. Nevertheless, these didn't stop a few stubborn, hardy souls from leaping onto the machine and coming up with a string of unofficial arcade conversions, usually of the same 3 or 4 most popular coin-ops of the time. Arcades were still the places where all the newest, hottest gaming action was happening, you guys. Every other machine was a damn Space Invaders cabinet to cater to the older lags and the youngsters that were training themselves up for the more intense Defender. And arcade cabinet manufacturers were all still trying to outdo one another with some wildly wonderful new coin ops, several of which are now highly regarded as classics in the gaming industry. Good ol' Atari here were the ones that released the very first 3D vector graphics game, a spectacular and incredibly suspenseful tank blast 'em up called Battlezone. as well as the trackball-controlled blaster game called Centipede. Allegedly, this was the first coin-op that had been designed and developed by a woman, too. And then there came Mooncresta, a skillful up-the-screen shooter that was made famous for this spacecraft docking sequence. Midway's Gorf had 5 total screens of varying action at once and was one of the first ever arcade games to incorporate a full-on speech synthesizer. During its attract sequence, it would call out things like "Long live Gorf." Phoenix by Centuri was a Galaxians variant with squawking birds that hatched out of zigzagging eggs and had the novelty of a deflector shield button that players could maniacally smash whenever things started to get a bit too dicey. The Galaxians themselves spawned its own sequel in the form of Galaga, Namco's very own follow-up that pitted players against faster and much more cunning alien bastards that tried to capture their spacecraft as well as totally obliterate the thing. Namco were also solely responsible for the wildest and most successful arcade cabinet release of 1981. You guessed it, my friends, PacMan. And unlike nearly every other coin-op of the time, PacMan was totally void of missiles, lasers, bombs, and fancy explosions. PacMan instead granted players direct control of a giant, circular, hungry yellow mouth with eyes even that waka waka waka'd around a large and twisting maze, swallowing dots and trying to outsmart 4 pesky ghost dudes. I was never all that good at PacMan myself, but I'll be damned if this simple game was not an absolute blast to play regardless. So much so that PacMan pretty much became an overnight success, and huge licensing deals were struck for PacMan pillowcases, lunchboxes, records, and even cartoon shows. All of this making Namco the wealthiest arcade company in the world. The legend goes that Namco's boss, Masaya Nakamura, awarded PacMan's creator a $3,500 bonus. However, the man himself, whose name was not recorded for some reason, was so goddamn annoyed at having been given such a piffling share of the game's success that he totally vanished from the video game industry entirely, never again to be seen. While PacMan was undoubtedly the most successful arcade cabinet of 1981, the most momentous arcade game was Donkey Kong, which introduced what are perhaps the most recognizable and important names to the entire video gaming realm. Donkey Kong was created by a company called Nintendo, an incredibly vast Japanese corporation that made its sole fortune by manufacturing Japanese Hanafuda playing cards of all things. At the time, they had only recently moved over into the video game business. However, they came without a whole lot of staggering success. The man behind the inception of Donkey Kong was an industrial design graduate and titan named Shigeru Miyamoto, and the character he established with Donkey Kong was an obscene, big-nosed, mustachioed dude named Mario. And in spite of an attempted injunction by the Titanic King Kong movie producers Universal Studios, Donkey Kong turned out to be a monumental success, even garnering its very own pillowcases and whimsical cartoon show. And it only paved the road ahead for those 3 iconic names for several more years still to come. As the end of 1981 quickly approached, it had become increasingly apparent in the eyes of several that this was going to be the first major electronic video game Christmas. Electronic toys were everywhere by the end of 1981, lining the shelves of every store and resting in the hands of every entertainment enthusiast. At the low end of the price scale were handheld versions of extremely popular arcade hits that sold for between $20 and $30. Space Invaders and Pac-Man wannabes were plentiful as well, and Nintendo had started to take its shot in the dark with a wide range of Game & Watch toys. NB Games' Microvision was the most advanced handheld on the market at the time, possessing the ability to accept interchangeable game cartridges. This was a full 10 years before the Game Boy, mind you. The simple displays and the squeaking sounds, however, didn't accurately simulate the whole arcade experience. Atari's VCS had been gaining momentum all year, acquiring a huge and incredibly strong catalog of games, with the whispered promise of so much more still to come. Atari's $99 pack included a VCS, a pair of joysticks, a pair of paddles, which are the rotary controllers that players use for Pong-style games, as well as the combat cartridge, which included a bunch of tank and aircraft shoot-'em-ups. On the heels of the VCS, and high on most Christmas wish lists, was the Atari Space Invaders cartridge. This thing contained 112 variations of the standard arcade game, adding invisible aliens that were armed with bendy bullets. And the other major seller under the Atari name was its VCS conversion of Asteroids, which had 66 game variations and added features from the original as well as a few from Asteroids Deluxe. This is totally insane, you guys, that we seem to get so much more for our money way back then. I mean, what the fuck happened, you guys? There were several kids at the time that had their sights set higher than an Atari. The machine they all wanted was Mattel's Intellivision, which would cost about $200 but was capable of much better graphics and much more sophisticated games that one could occupy their time with. Even back then, it seems there was no shortage of graphics horrors. Anyways, Mattel advertised this thing on TV by showing the soccer game that was included with the machine. It looked totally awesome because for the first time, the screen showed a grandstand view of the action and the game's player characters were actually shaped like people. Atari's soccer cartridge, for the sake of comparison, was a rather hopeless, lame-ass top-down affair for the eyes in which the player characters looked a lot like those joke diagrams that we have all seen of the Mexicans riding the bicycles. Needless to say, a high-quality soccer game was worth so much to European and British gamers. There also existed the promise of a plug-in keyboard that would transform the Intellivision into a 16K home computer, an option that provided a lot of leverage for young kids that were all trying to persuade their parents into buying and owning an Intellivision machine, which would hopefully entice them into the growing revolution of computer gaming and all of its guaranteed educational wonders. And for those that had absolutely no clue at all, there existed the Philips G7000. This thing was a big silver console with a built-in touch-sensitive keyboard that was hardly ever used during active gameplay at all, but I mean, at least it had one. The games supported by the Philips G7000 were mediocre at best, though there were a few novelty variations to be had on the classics. Whenever your tank was blasted in Space Monsters, for instance, the Philips version of Space Invaders, then the driver would be ejected to stand mid-screen, forced to run and find cover while you waited for a new tank to spawn in and join the fight. There was also a highly superb version of PacMan that arrived just before the G7000 died out for good. This was essentially the first console war, and it was also in October of '81 when the very first issue of the world's very first video game magazines would hit the shelves, its name being Computer and Video Games, of course. And so, the rage of the retro era had begun, and this will mark the end of our second lesson involving the rise of video games. Part 3 will be coming soon, my friends, and until then, I have been the fabulous Samantha Rose, and I welcome you all in joining the channel as a subscriber if you're not already. All you need to do is hit that button down below. Easy. Until next time, stay frosty out there.